Welcome to the King of Games 98! On this episode, it's Panzer Dragoon Saga versus Spyro the Dragon.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's special The King of Games 98 bonus episode of the Region Free Gamers podcast, the podcast fluent in gaming. Joining me today, out of Brooklyn, wearing his crusty curmudgeon pants, Ozzy.
Hey, I'm walking over here.
Jesus Christ. And also joining us, bringing a ray of sunshine to cut through Ozzy's dark cloud, Kelly, aka Sierra Night Gaming on Instagram. How's it going, Kelly?
Hey, everyone.
Thanks again for joining us. This is going to be a really fun one today, I can tell you.
I'm going to try to redeem myself, with Kelly from, the last episode. And
You're gonna actually make it worse.
Yeah, probably.
We shall see.
I shouldn't even try.
I feel like I have to take the opposite stance of you just so we can continue arguing.
Yes, exactly. So
Can you just speak over me all the time? Just speak all over me.
Okay. Will do.
So,
go, Paul.
No problem. Before we get to today's topic, I gotta thank everyone for listening and especially for interacting with us, via email, via social media, whatever the case may be. We really appreciate it. And you know what? If you can, tell a friend about the show and don't forget to leave us a rating and a review on the Apple Podcasts app. 5 stars, please. And to those of you who have left us a review and a rating, thanks.
Yeah,
Really
by my
appreciate
estimation, Paul, I think that this will probably release around March, perhaps. So I hope that by that time we'll have hit the podcast motherload because so many people hit us with reviews. So
Yep.
I'm counting on all you guys, and I'm sending a message to the future saying thank you.
Gosh, it
for
really is
making
going to
us
be.
hit
It really is going to be
the big
March,
one.
eh?
Yeah.
So
We're recording this in December, by the way.
yeah, we're recording this in December, and just to give a little bit of background here. So I started this intro. You heard me say the King of Games 98. Up until now, December, we've just released our first episode of this series. We actually didn't really know what we were going to call it. We were going with the Battle of Games 98, and somehow it's morphed now into the King of Games 98, which is a stupid story that I'm not going to waste everybody's time with now. Instead, what I did was I wasted Kelly's time with it before the show.
Yes.
So, yeah, I guess this one's in December, and we're going to release this one, I think, February or March. This is, number 6 that we're going to release, even though now it's the last one that we're recording?
No, it would be the 8th. I mean, there are 16 entries, so this would be the 8th. So
I'm going to have to look at the bracket again, and maybe even cut this part out entirely, since it's, aggressively uninteresting.
nothing like sitting behind the scenes in a live show.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, this series that we're doing, for those of you who haven't heard one of the episodes in this series before, basically the conceit of this is that we are looking at the year 1998 in video games. In our opinion, the best year in gaming. It was deep, it was innovative. We just saw a ton of classics that year. We wanted to do an episode where we talked about the games of 98 and quickly realized that that was a fool's errand. And so instead now we're doing a series where we pit 16 games against each other in a bracket-style format and then decide which game is the best game of 98. So and before we get started today with Panzer Dragoon Saga and Spyro the Dragon, Ozzy, I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about how great Spyro is.
Don't tempt me.
So before we get to those, just to give everybody a heads up on how we go about selecting a winner for today, we're pretty much looking at 5 different criteria. The first one is critical reception. So we want to see how each of these games were reviewed critically and what the sales numbers look like. We want to look at whether the game was genre defining or how it defined its genre, how it stacks up to other games in its genre.
Yeah, and I think you could kind of loop that into legacy, which is also one of our metrics. Kind of genre defining and legacy kind of go hand in hand.
Ozzy, we have 5 criteria. Why are you making this muddy before we start?
Because that's what's described on our website, Paul.
Oh, seriously? I didn't know that.
I'm that serious.
All right. Anyway, the third criteria after genre-defining / legacy is personal attachment, which is how do we feel about these games personally? Highly subjective, of course, because there's only 3 of us here. We can't accurately surmise how everybody feels about these games.
Yeah, Spyro's gonna get all the love here, with people in their 30s to 40s.
It really is, especially after doing some research on it. But anyway, and then the last thing is head to head. So how do these games compare against each other? And I guess more key, which one would we rather play, and which do we think is more important to its genre? Right.
But let me ask you, Paul, how the fuck did Spyro get in here?
Okay. Let's stop. Let's stop, Old Man Garcia, and backpedal for a moment here. Spyro's not that bad. God, man, I can't believe you're putting me in this position because,
seriously,
I was ready.
It's like Panama in the World Cup. It's cute, but they don't stand a chance.
You're already leaning in. Let's backpedal here. We have a format to follow, sir. Don't worry. We'll take the leash off you soon.
All right.
So. Just to give everybody a little bit of background on these games, I mean, I'm assuming most people who are listening to this podcast know about these games, kind of know what the deal is, but we'll give a little bit more information just to kind of get started here. We'll start off with Panzer Dragoon Saga, just because it's the first one on the list here I have on my paper. So Panzer Dragoon Saga released April 30th, 1998. Developed by Team Andromeda, who were responsible for the original Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon Zwei, or Zwei. I'm not German. Set your expectations accordingly. And that one was released as a sequel to the original. The creator, Yukio Futatsugi.
Yeah, it was actually 2 creators, Yukio Futatsugi and Manabu Kusunoki.
Yes.
They were kind of the 2 that were most instrumental to the Panzer Dragoon series as a whole, and Kusunoki was actually one of the ones that was most influential in its look, in its art design. He was very influenced by Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind.
Yes.
And you can clearly see that aesthetic influence in Panzer Dragoon Saga. So it's really the brainchild of these 2 creators. I wouldn't say it's just Futatsugi, even though he's more closely identified with it. And Kusunoki was actually the team leader. The game actually went through various directors because it was quite a bit troubled. And, eventually kind of like 40% through the way, Kusunoki was made the final director, and he saw the team through to completion.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that. And with a game like, not even a game, with a series like Panzer Dragoon, that look is really arguably even more key to identifying it than any of the gameplay elements are. So I
would say it's the biggest thing.
I would too. I didn't want to be presumptuous.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's not like I want to be hyperbolic. I mean, my problem with the Panzer Dragoon games is that, I love their aesthetic. It's just with respect to the first and the second one, there's not a lot of depth. There's not too much that you can make with an on-rails shooter. You're just set on rails, and there's only so much you can do in terms of variety.
Yeah.
But it's just everything around it. The package around it is so well meshed and so, elegant that it just brings it up another level that, compared to any other game that would be on rail shooters. I mean, let me just mention another one like Elemental Gearbolt or something. I mean, if this game looked like Elemental Gearbolt, it wouldn't be as fondly remembered.
No, not even close.
So I think the aesthetics of it, I think, are the biggest thing. And so much of it is kind of derived from Mobius and, the artwork of French artist Mobius and Nausicaa. I think those are the 2 biggest influences on the Panzer Dragoon aesthetic.
Yeah, you could do worse than that. So as far as Saga is concerned, Ozzy, I know you haven't played it because, I mean, it's a very difficult game to find, and very few people played it in North America and Europe back when it was released. Kelly, I know you do have it, though. Did you get a chance to play it yet?
I have played about 5 hours of it, I believe. Just because I started it a few years back, and once I turned off my Sega Saturn, I realized the battery was dead and lost all my progress.
Oh, no.
So, yeah, from there, it was just like, whenever that happens to me, I just put the game aside for a while. But I did actually decide to boot up the Sega Saturn last night, and I did play a couple hours of it again, and still awesome game. So, yes. Yes.
You know what struck me? Just going over the long plays, it's a game that takes like 12 minutes just to input your name. There are a lot of cutscenes.
Yes.
I did not expect that in a game from 1998.
Yeah.
The only other game that I would expect that from would be Metal Gear Solid, which came out that same year. And it's really impressive. I mean, for better or for worse, how much in the way of cutscenes there is in this game.
Especially at the beginning, it really kind of sets the table with that. There are fewer cutscenes as you go through, at least on the first disc. I'll be honest with you, from the second disc onward, I don't actually remember. But the first disc, lots of cutscenes right at the beginning, and then it tapers off, and it kind of just gives them to you piecemeal with a little bit more gameplay. So I guess this leads to the question, because we were talking about the art, we were talking about all this other stuff. Like, Kelly, what was the thing that... you played it for a couple hours. You played it for 5 hours before your Saturn gave you the middle finger. What is it about it that sticks out the most to you?
For the time, just having the graphics for the time are amazing. The soundtrack. So I was listening to last night, and I just made sure the rest of the house was quiet so I could actually listen to what was going on. It was just great. And then the battle system itself, it's so unique. You're just one person on a dragon, and they still managed to make an engaging RPG battle system out of that with positioning and everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really interesting game in that way. I found the battle system. I'm very fond of saying, if you haven't played it, then you haven't played it. Because it sounds pretty cool, and I want to make myself sound cool, but also because it's a very unique game. Like, that battle system is really unlike anything else out there. Ozzy, you haven't seen anything like it, like?
Having not played it, it's hard for me to grasp what's going on with the battle system. I mean, I know that there's a whole positional aspect of kind of rotating around the enemies, but it's hard for me to understand what exactly needs to be done. It's not as intuitive as a Final Fantasy battle system, where you know that you're just clicking on a menu and there's magic, there's attack, there's defense. But with this one, it just kind of feels, what they wanted to do is a mixture of the shooting mechanics of Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2 and an RPG battle system. And, going over the oral history of the game from the creators, they really struggled with creating a battle system, because apparently, I mean, the artists wanted, something that was really kind of fancy and had animations and stuff like that, while the programmers kind of wanted more of a shooter type thing that was more responsive, and immediate. And so the merging of those two proved particularly tricky, particularly because the team did not have prior RPG experience. They eventually brought someone on that did have that RPG experience, but it's a hybrid that I don't see it in any other games. I don't think I've ever seen it in any other games. And, it's kind of an island unto itself, really.
And they got it right. I think that's really the key here, because there's both look, it's not the most complex battle system. Let's not kid ourselves, right? Like, even compared to its contemporaries, we'll say Final Fantasy VII, we'll say Xenogears, etc., etc. I don't know. Xenogears actually wasn't that complicated either, but Final Fantasy VII was a little bit deeper in the limit breaks and the materia and so on and so forth. There was a level of depth there that Saga doesn't have. But what Saga does,
I don't know. I mean, I feel like Xenogears is, it's a digression, but I feel like Xenogears is a little bit more complex than Final Fantasy VII in its battle system.
I don't remember either way. I'm just going off of memory. I'll trust you on that. Yeah. Was it worth interrupting me for that, Ozzy?
No, it wasn't, but please go ahead.
Sorry, what Saga has...
So much passive aggressiveness on this episode.
So anyway, what Saga does
Do I just bring it out
is...
for you or something? I don't know.
I'm not gonna make my point here. That's what's gonna happen. No, but in reality, though, what Saga has is what it lacks in that complexity, it has in an immediacy. And I know, Ozzy, that you haven't played it. Kelly, you have, so you know what I'm talking about. When you're moving around, when you're attacking, there's no going to a menu and selecting these things. The only time you actually go to a menu and select something is when you want to cast some kind of magic, which, you know, they call it berserk forces, whatever. That's not, it's magic, right? That's what it is in all these games. So that's the only time where you actually enter a menu and select something. Otherwise, you're moving your dragon around the 4 quadrants with using the control pad, and you're attacking with your 2 different weapons using a button press. So it really has a very nice flow to it, and it still manages to be complex enough to be satisfying, where there are different strategies that you can use in it. And on top of that, we have the mechanic that I love in RPGs, where they rate how well you performed in the battle. Because you don't, I mean, grinding, you know, not everybody's a fan, I get it. But one thing that really helps with grinding is when you have a set goal for the randomest crappy battle that you don't care about. Like, how well can I do on this inconsequential interruption to my game? You know what I mean?
Yes. I enjoy, too, the fact that, because restarting it last night, just the tutorial, it only took a few minutes. I mean, I can remember like Final Fantasy VIII just going through tutorial after tutorial, just, oh, please get it over with. This one was like, here's how you do this. We're done. You can get moving now. And I just really appreciated that. And the battle system is just so fluid, too. Even to this day, it's a very entertaining battle system to go along with.
It's nice to look at, too, isn't it?
Yes.
It also seems like, I mean, it seems like it's one of the first times where developers really try to bridge that divide between action games and RPGs, and it's almost like an action RPG in that sense. Would you say, Paul?
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's very much like an action RPG, except that it's done completely different from your standard one. Because I think when we think of conventional action RPGs, we think of hero or heroine holding sword, moving around, stopping, slashing, hitting start to access your inventory, and so on, right? Whereas Panzer Dragoon Saga, you're on a dragon, which is way cooler.
That's a very scientific point. No, but I guess what I'm asking is, I mean, because at this same time, this same year, we had another game kind of do the same thing. And that was Parasite Eve. And Parasite Eve was actually directed, and the battle design was done by the same person that did the Chrono Trigger battle system. And it also allowed you to move, and it had that element of action where you were dodging enemy actions and enemy hits, but you were positioning yourself around the battlefield. Panzer Dragoon Saga seems to limit that to the 4 quadrants. And it just kind of sticks to that. So there's a little bit more freedom in something like a Parasite Eve, but it's just kind of interesting to see how 2 developers, in different silos, you're sort of trying to tackle the same issue. How to make it more engaging so that your actions are more direct and that you don't have to rely upon a menu in order to, make your actions.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. The only knock against Parasite Eve is that while you have more freedom of movement with positioning, you're not on a dragon. And I think the game
going somewhere there.
I think the game suffers for that.
No, I mean, listen, in a fair world, we would be talking right now about Panzer Dragoon Saga versus Parasite Eve, but we're not. So
I guess that's the cue to move on to Spyro, isn't it?
Dragon versus dragon.
Oh, you know what? Oh my god, that didn't occur to me until right now. Yeah, did you
realize this?
Did you?
No.
Really?
You're not dealing with rocket surgeons here, Kelly. Like, this is not.
I hope you're not operating on rockets. That would just be.
Oh man, this episode's a mess.
Anyhow, Spyro the Dragon. We'll rein it in here before we let it go again. Spyro the Dragon now, the other contender here. Release date.
Contender?
Yes. Release date, September 10th, 1998. developed by Insomniac Games, and we all know Insomniac Games by now. Most recently, they did Marvel's Spider-Man on the PS4, which was a huge hit. They've worked on Spyro, they've worked on Resistance. You know,
Ratchet and Clank. Ratchet and Clank. That's
like,
their best
to
series.
me, most notably, yeah. Like I love.
That's
Ratchet
their best
and Clank.
series.
Yeah.
I'm waiting to see if you remember my favorite game that they've done. That would be
won't.
Sunset Overdrive.
Oh, I thought you were going to say
Oh.
Fuse. I was like... Sunset Overdrive is pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's a shame that game kind of fell by the wayside because of the poor support of the Xbox One.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that was a pretty cool game.
That's one that we're going to be talking about in like 5 or 6 years. You know what I mean? Like the cult classic, the overlooked. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
It was destined to follow in the same footsteps of Jet Set Radio. You know, it was very influenced by Jet Set Radio, and it almost had kind of like the same arch. You know, like people were excited for it. Some people bought it, they really loved it, and then most of the public just did not, you know, buy it at all. And
Yeah.
so it's going to be rediscovered at some later point.
Yeah.
But Insomniac Game just freshly bought by Sony, which made everyone ask, wasn't this already the case?
Yeah, no kidding.
I think everyone thought that they had been, you know, Sony owned for years, but they were not. They were actually requested, you know, they were actually offered to be bought by Sony together with Naughty Dog, and they declined. They said, we want to stay independent, which I think in the long run, I think that was a good move because they really were able to do a lot of things that I don't think they would have been able to do if they had just stuck with Sony. But yeah, now they're with Sony and they can keep on making Spider-Man games. No, but by the way, let me say something about Insomniac. And hopefully this is not too much of a digression. I like Insomniac. But Insomniac to me is one of the best developers at making also ran games. Almost every single one of their games, it's a copy of whatever's popular at the time. You see the first game that they did, which was Disruptor, a Doom clone.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then they did Spyro, a platforming clone. And then they did Ratchet and Clank, a 3D platforming clone. And then they did Resistance, a first-person shooter clone. And now they're doing an open world game, which we all know we have too many open world games right now. So I like them. They do very well polished games, but I have never seen them do something truly innovative and really break the mold. And that's about as negative as I will get on Insomniac, but I just needed to get that out of the chest because I think that's sometimes missed, that they tend to be very derivative, unfortunately. And I think Sunset Overdrive was one of their more original, you know, titles, which is also a shame why it didn't take off.
Which is
Yeah,
a shame that
I agree.
Spider-Man is Sunset Overdrive 2 with a different skin. Oh.
Well, yeah, there's that. But I did really like Spider-Man. I thought that was a very well-made game. And you know what I like the most about it is that I could beat it in 10 hours. That was probably my favorite part.
Yeah.
If you just wanted to mainline the game. But anyways, back to Spyro.
Yeah, well, you know what? No, back to Insomniac. I think there is. See, here's the thing, though. Like we romanticize these developers who innovate and do new things, and even though those things may be flawed, and I do that as much as anybody else, right? And I will continue to do that because I always want new gaming experiences. But you know, I think calling Insomniac derivative, like. I think if you're a chef and you make the best steak in town, it doesn't mean that you know what I mean? It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be appreciated just because you're doing something that everybody else is doing.
No, I'm not saying anything bad in terms of like Insomniac not being deserving of the praise that they've gotten. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that, like you said, that they haven't really done something that really advances the medium in some way. I think all their games have, you know, pre-Resistance, a lot of charm. Resistance was like one of the drabbest settings in any video games ever. And then they did Fuse, which was also absolutely generic in every which way. Even that game that they released, Song of the Deep, which was like a Metroidvania, was very cute in its aesthetic, but it was also extremely derivative. But, you know, they're like workhorses. They're the reliable, you know, 290 batter, you know, to put like a baseball analogy. Like, they're going to get you the clutch hits when you need them, you know, and they're going to be a great all-around utility player. that could be the MVP. That could be what you need. And I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think it's really a boon, for Sony to snag them. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Ted Price has done a great job, stewarding that whole company.
Yeah, he really has. I can't say, I mean, I really can't, other than the fact that, like you said, they're not necessarily innovating. They're just very well polished at what they do. It's hard to find any fault with them. They've been run very, very well. Anyway, back to Spyro, which we'll probably have less kind things to say about. So, you know what? Knowing that that's going to happen, because we talked about this before the show, I'll start with Kelly, because I have a feeling Kelly won't be quite as hard on it as you, Ozzy. Kelly, am I right?
We'll see.
Well, let me ask you this then. Did you play Spyro when it first came out?
I did not, and I only dabbled in it a little a few years later. I had a friend that really wanted me to play it, so she let me borrow her copy. I think I put it in for about 20 minutes, so it was a platforming collectathon, and gave it back to her.
And you pieced out. And you probably said, screw this.
Yeah.
Oh, man. And this is pretty much going to be, I think, the refrain from all of us. Like, Here's the thing with Spyro. It's impossible to call it anything other than a platforming collectathon, and it's one that, in my opinion, has, it's a great technical achievement for the PlayStation. It was an important game for the system at that time, because you had Nintendo 64 kind of, I wouldn't say cornering that, under 12 child market, but yeah. I think Sony needed something comparable to Mario and Banjo. And like I said, while Spyro is not as charming as Banjo and probably not as well executed, it does have its own pluses over Banjo, and showed, that Sony actually had this mascot that could provide a similar experience. Am I off base here, Ozzy?
No. I mean, I think that what you had was Crash on the PS1, but that was a linear experience.
Yes.
That did not include an open world, and I much rather prefer Crash, to be quite frank. I think that Crash Warped was the better game of 1998, but at the same time, you needed to feel that niche. On the Nintendo 64, you had Mario 64, you had Banjo-Kazooie. On the PS1, you had Jersey Devil?
Blasto.
You really needed this, filler. You needed to fill this gap that was there, and I think the problem with us talking about Spyro, and I'm trying to be as neutral and as objective as possible, is that it really caught us. No, I know. It really caught us at the wrong time. There are a lot of people that love Spyro. I think it's a game that has a very nostalgic reputation. I mean, the fact that there is a remastered version that people bought in droves really is a testament to the popularity of the character itself.
Yes.
And these games. The problem is that by the time that this released, I was 11. And so I was probably 3 years too old for this. And Paul, you were probably in your 20s. Kelly, I'm not going to try to decipher any ages.
Also, you're fossilizing me here. I wasn't that old.
Well, I mean, 18, yeah.
Yeah, you're right. It was 18 or 19. You're not that far off.
Yeah,
and you're right. Like we weren't the target demo for this game, and thus, like, I remember loading it up for the first time. Like, I had a buddy who, was my age and loved it, and I thought he was weird then, and I think he's weird now. And I loaded it up and I played it, and it was like, I think I might have lasted even less time than you, Kelly. I don't know. We should like rewind our memories and see who wins this one, because I was just like, what am I doing here? You know what I mean?
Kelly, you wanted to say something?
Well, basically for me, what I've noticed with Spyro is that it brought a lot of people into gaming too. Like the friend who let me borrow it that loved it, she was my age. And she wasn't a gamer, but it was like a good entry into gaming for her. And researching it a bit, it looks like that was the case for a lot of people. It actually initially had pretty low sales, but then after the Christmas season of 98, the people who got it for Christmas, other people saw them playing it, and they were the ones that wanted to play it. They've never played a game before. They had mothers, grandmothers that wanted to play Spyro, and that's how it became so popular.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. I think it was a perfect entry point. I think in that respect, it did exactly what it set out to do. I don't think that they were trying to make a game for the teenagers, the edgy teenagers. Spyro is too wholesome for that. It's a game that doesn't wear any cynicism on its sleeve. It's really very pure. And that's because it's meant for, the under 12 or 11 demographic. And I think, or new gamers. And I think that if you look particularly now, I mean, you start to feel old when you see all these YouTubers basically say, well, I loved this thing when I was a kid and I played it to no end. And this was the game that got me into gaming and all that. I mean,
Yep.
And that's awesome because there are a ton of games that people probably consider shitty that I love. And I'm not saying Spyro's shitty. It's not at all. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the nostalgia attachment is big with this one. And we can't really extricate that from our evaluation of the game itself.
No, we can't. It's like I might have said earlier, I can't even remember what I said 20 minutes ago now, but this game is actually, I grudgingly say it's a lot better than I expected. And better is a very, broad word, but just revisiting it and revisiting what people have to say about it and what it does right. And it does a lot of things right, like a lot of things. I have to say, I think it's worthy of being in R16. I get that you'd want Parasite Eve over it, Ozzy, and I don't disagree with you there. But I think Arnie was correct in kind of, forcing us to put Spyro on the list.
No, I mean, I think the argument that we had was whether to put this or Crash Warped. And I think the decision was that Crash Warped was the the second sequel.
Yeah.
And we should put something that's original. And I think that game was much more varied. It had much more interesting dynamics, much more interesting settings. I mean, just going back to my experience with Spyro, I mean, I first saw the game, again, I was 11, and I saw it because some kid had it, and I played it for 2 minutes. And I didn't like the drifty feel of the character. I did not like how empty it all felt. I felt like it was pointless, which is kind of the whole shtick with collectathon platformers.
Yeah,
It's
that's
really
the thing
pointless.
about them in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I just completely bounced off of it, which did not happen with a game like Crash, which felt much more urgent. You had a goal, you had to do it. It was much more in the vein of a traditional platformer. I mean, there's a reason why the collectathon platformers are no longer popular and why something like Yooka-Laylee, which was trying to tap into that vein, did not succeed and was very poorly, perceived by the public because people realize, oh, this wasn't actually that fun.
Yeah.
And I think that's really what it comes down to with Spyro. And you see something like even the sequel improved a whole lot because it just gave it a lot more variety. And when you have a collectathon platformer, you have to really make up a lot with your personality. A lot of it has to, come down to your charm. And I think that's something that they were trying to feel out in the first one. And in the first one, they had some charm with respect to the dragons you rescue, etc. But the sequels, they actually dialed up the personality of all the characters, and it felt much more like a Saturday morning cartoon.
Yes.
And I think it does that very well. The first one was still kind of like a prototype, in my view. It was just kind of like, let's get the mechanics of this working right, and let's try to add a story, a very bare bones story to it, and then, we can iterate in a sequel. I think really that's what they were trying to do.
I agree with you, and it's interesting because it makes me wonder, since you've brought that up, what would happen if they had focused more on the aesthetic and the personality of the game and less on the gameplay? Then we'd have a loose game that is probably remembered fondly for different reasons. I wonder which one I would prefer. I don't know.
I would prefer the latter. I would rather that I have a charming game, with very flawed mechanics than the other way around. I mean, except for if that flawed mechanic is a terrible camera, those are some of the things I just can't forgive.
Yeah, no, of course, 'cause that's motion sickness inducing and so on, right? I think the goal of a game, I think the first goal of a game should be to not make me barf. Is that okay to say?
That is a very good goal, but it was a very well rendered game. I mean, the technology behind Spyro was extremely impressive. Particularly for the PS1, which had that waviness in its textures.
Yeah.
It's not a platform that could achieve the same rendering as the Nintendo 64 in terms of its polygons, because it had just a different rendering method, that gave it that wavy kind of nausea-inducing feel. And certainly there's a lot of that in Spyro, but it feels a lot tighter than many other games that were kind of, more open-ended of the period.
Yeah, it really does. And just to come back to it, before we take a break, so we're going to take a break here in a second, but Kelly, what about you? Would you rather have the game that is like more charming and more artistically driven, but plays like crap, or the game that plays really well and has kind of, bare bones aesthetic?
I have gotten through many a game that has had charming story, an engaging story, and crap mechanics. But for some reason, the other way around, I usually end up dropping them. So, yeah, I'm very much story-driven.
Interesting.
Yeah. No, there are a lot of people. I mean, I have friends that they much favor gameplay, over story. They don't really care about the story. I'm just not one of those persons. I think that's also, Kelly, why we like RPGs.
Yes.
It's like an RPG, you kind of do the same thing over and over again for hours. But the story is what keeps you going, and the characters and being attached to those characters. I think really that's a testament to which one wins out in our view.
Yeah, my husband's actually vice versa. He'll smash through buttons to get through that story as quickly as possible, but he'll play Blitzball for hours in Final Fantasy X. So
I think I'm with him. I think I'm in his camp. Please let him know that I also agree. Blitzball, probably the greatest minigame in an RPG ever. Anyhow,
all right, that's a discussion for another day.
That is definitely a discussion for another day. Like Panzer Dragoon versus Spyro. Let's talk Blitzball. Anyhow, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to go through our now 4 criteria, and we're going to pick a winner from these 2. All right, everyone, we're back. And so now we're going to be going through our 4 criteria for these 2 games to figure out which one will advance to the next round of this very, very important tournament. So the first thing we're going to look at here is public reception. Basically, what we're looking at is how did each of these games do critically and commercially? And we have some crazy numbers here to look at, mainly because Panzer Dragoon Saga clearly a victim of the system that it was on, yeah?
yes.
Yeah, it's like these are like the inverse of each other.
Yeah,
like,
they really are.
Panzer did very bad in terms of sales. Spyro did great in terms of sales. And Panzer did much better in terms of ranking. And Spyro was, good.
Yeah. Hey, man, it like, if you're looking at game rankings in particular, Spyro, look, 85% average is no slouch, right? And rightfully so. Like, what it sets out to do, it does well. Panzer Dragoon, we're talking like 93s. You know what I mean? Like, this is a game.
Yeah, at a time where 93s were not very common. I think afterwards we started seeing a lot more 10s.
Yeah.
But back in the day, publications did not really give out a lot of 10s.
No, it was.
And so usually
rare.
It was 9s for the most part.
Yeah.
So if you had a 9, you could say you were one of the best games, of that year.
Yes, absolutely. So just to give some numbers here, besides those game rankings numbers, sales in Japan for Panzer Dragoon Saga, about 100,000 copies were sold, which is fairly miserable. Like, there's just no way to sugarcoat it. In Japan, the Saturn was actually far more successful than anywhere else, and yet, only 100,000 copies, not great. And in the USA, well, I mean, 1998 was basically a write-off of a year for Sega. At this point, they were phasing out the Saturn completely. So about 20 to 30,000 copies were produced of Saga. And in Europe, I mean, I'm reading here 1,000 copies. Is that correct?
That's what I've read too. So.
Yeah.
Jeez, man, 1,000 copies of a game out there in circulation. Like, I can't believe I can't believe it doesn't even cost even more than it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it's incredible because Sega was really building this to be the Final Fantasy killer.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that seems to be the story that people latch onto, but, internally, this team was tasked with making something that could go toe to toe with Final Fantasy on the PS1, because the way that the developers phrase it, this was really seen as a war with Sony. They really needed to prove themselves. And, they kind of saw themselves as a very counterculture, punkish, team that was doing something that was iconoclastic, that it was really doing away with the, establishment mentality of like the mainstream design. And it just completely flunked. I mean, Team Andromeda was disbanded after this. Sega was like, that's it. We can't do anything with you guys. Like, this thing failed. But they didn't really have a chance. I mean, maybe in Japan they would have had a little bit of a chance, but it came out in 98. And by that point, the Sega Dreamcast was already, going to be released in a few months.
Yep.
So Sega basically, pulled the plug before it even released it, to be quite frank.
Yep. It's weird that Team Andromeda could kind of bear the brunt of this failure when, Sega Corporate is basically phasing out the system that it's being released on, right? In spite of the Saturn being more successful in Japan, the Dreamcast, like you said, it's released later that year, and you've basically got, for any fans of Sega and their brand and their style of games, you're sitting on a dead system, really. Like, the PlayStation was by far the dominant force in the industry at that time.
Yeah, and from what I've read, I mean, it was absolutely brutal on the developers. I mean, not only was this a very difficult development, because the reality is that Panzer Dragoon 1 and 2, it was a small team of like 15 people. And then for something like Panzer Dragoon Saga, where you had to create an entire RPG with a whole world, they had to scale up to 50. And that really made, for a clash in culture. They did not have any experience in RPGs, and so they had to adapt to a new genre. And on top of that, they were working with a system that was not built for 3D. It was a 2D powerhouse that was made to run 3D. And that brought about a lot of difficulties. And from what I've read, the developers say that they were very depressed after this. I mean, they thought that they were failures. And a lot of them ended up leaving Sega. Some of them went to Sony. Some of them went to Smilebit, where they eventually would work on Panzer Dragoon Orta. But as a whole, I mean, this was really the end of that generation of developers. I mean, a lot of them were very young, and a lot of them just were cut short because this game failed so badly.
To me, it's so sad to look at the development of this game. You have Sega going, oh, you're going to be the next Final Fantasy. You're going to be a huge game. And then they're just like, we're done with the system. We're going to move on. I mean, from what I was reading too, the development team would sleep in the offices. I mean, that seems to be more common now, but back then they were sleeping in the offices. 2 people died that were part of the development team, one of them from a motorcycle accident that they think was caused by stress, the other one suicide. So you have people putting their heart and souls into this game, and then Sega just left them to die.
Well, I mean, the main creator, I forgot his name now, he basically says that he doesn't have any good memories of his time doing this. I mean, a lot of the other developers say that they have very good memories because they were just doing a lot of crazy things, and they really felt like they were kind of going against the grain. But the people at the top, management, I mean, they were just suffering because they could see how there were this clashing personalities within the team, at the bottom, and then at the top, Sega was just not giving you the support that you needed. So it must have been, terrible for all of them. I mean, I wouldn't have faulted any of them for just leaving games entirely.
I wouldn't either. That's... It amazes me even that more developers don't leave video games. Like, this development for video games must be like this, heavily ingrained dream, because the conditions are often terrible. And this has been going on forever, right? It's been more publicized, in the recent future, or in the recent... Man, you think I know how to speak English by now? But it's been more publicized recently how terrible working conditions have been in the industry. I'm both surprised and in a way unsurprised that more people don't leave, because it is a grind compared to like your average 9-to-5 job.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and the thing is that, you know, you develop this game for 2 to 3 years and you put everything into it, and then you're basically left, you know, for someone on a podcast to basically rant about your game, you know, and that's it.
But you know what? I think if we could go back in time and tell these development teams, hey, you know, in 20 years, your game is still going to be talked about, it's still going to be remembered, and it's still going to be very heavily praised. I don't know, like, would you be happy with that, Kelly?
I mean, go ahead, Kelly.
I don't know. It would be a very weird thing, because by that point, 20 years, I would have moved on to something else. So everyone likes that immediate praise, that seeing everything do well. 20 years later, would I still care, or would I have been moved on to something else?
You will have lost your youth by then, Kelly.
Already have.
I mean, it's kind of the same thing that, you know, true genius is not really perceived, you know, during their lifetimes. I mean, art is very rarely appreciated
While you're alive. Yeah.
While it's released. I mean, I think in terms of video games, that's not necessarily the case, because a lot of the ones that are very heavily praised are kind of those cutting edge, you know, pushing the envelope type games. But at the same time, there are some games that fall through the cracks. And I think that everyone that played Panzer Dragoon Saga at the time, they were, you know, very fascinated by it. And it just kept on carrying this word of mouth and this kind of cult around it. And the developers did, you know, they got asked that, you know, I said, how do you feel about the game? And they said, well, you know, a lot of it is very unfavorable. A lot of it are not good memories, but it helped me grow. And I also appreciate the fact that there are still people that tell me that they enjoyed my game, and that really makes me feel good. And I think, you know, for the Japanese, that is more of a common thing, you know, where it's like, well, at least I did something good for someone. You know, I think if you were an American, perhaps they would probably be like, well, you know, screw it. I mean, I was cheated out of, you know, success, basically.
Yeah.
But I think the idea of like, I'm recognized for something that I did, I think that matters to them.
Yeah, I would hope so. Anyway, just from now, like, talking about it and how sad it is, I would hope that there's some positivity, you know, long term for some of these people, because it really did sound like a rough ride. Anyhow, going back to, you know, our official criteria here, I mean, I think we have to give this to Spyro, right? Like, you can't argue with the sales numbers. You can't argue with the giant wave of nostalgia that's been hitting us with the Reignited trilogy and so on. Am I wrong here? Do you guys disagree?
Yeah, that's why I hate this category.
No, I have to agree. I mean, even when in Instagram, when the Reignited trilogy came out, I just remember so many people being excited about it, and I was like, okay, more people have fond memories of it than I do. So
yep.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that when you're talking about like the ranking difference in terms of critical reception, I think you also have to consider how well the games have aged in terms of critical reception over time. I think that if you look at the 85 at the time that Spyro has, I think, you know, that's kind of about right. I don't know where Panzer Dragoon Saga falls, you know, whether that's like a 92, whether that's too high or that's too low. I haven't played the game, so I don't know Paul, how you feel about that.
I think it might be a little bit high. I hate to say it. Look, here's the thing, right? Like, this game was played by few people, right? And anything that's played or listened to or read by or watched by fewer people, it gains that kind of hipster quality, right? You've heard me rant about this before on the show. And so, you know, it gets that little bit of a bump, you know, like, oh, yeah. you haven't played this? Well, it's super amazing.
It's the Rondo
right?
of Blood effect.
It really is, right? So I see something like 93%, and I'm like, yeah, these are probably people who are very happy and thankful that they've got to play this game. And part of the reason for that is because they know so few other people have, and those other people also want to, right? So, you know, 93%, yeah, probably a bit high.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess in that sense, it's necessary to give it to Spyro. I mean, Spyro was a huge success then. It's still a huge success now. We're still talking about Spyro in 2019. I don't think we're talking about Panzer Dragoon Saga except in small circles, like us
collectors.
You know. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the public, I mean, that has very little knowledge about games or that lapse from games, at some point, they still recognize Spyro and they still have a desire to play Spyro. I mean, I think that really says a lot.
Well,
Yeah,
at the same
I
time,
agree.
with the remaster of Panzer Dragoon coming out, if they do happen to manage to somehow find source code or remake Panzer Dragoon Saga, we could be having a different discussion.
We could.
Yeah.
I think that would be some kind of remake of Saga. I actually think would do very, very well, just because you've had this like volcanic buildup over time ready to erupt. You know what I mean? There's been a lot of talk of it over the years. There's been a lot of, oh, you haven't played it and so on and so forth. I think if it was remade and finally released, or you know what, or maybe not. What do I know, right? I don't work at Sega or Nintendo.
I mean, I don't think that it would have a huge effect. I think Panzer Dragoon Saga, you can re-release it 10,000 times. I still think it's going to be a very niche game. I don't think even the Panzer Dragoon games, the original ones, they were not huge hits. I mean, they were moderate successes, but they were not huge hits. I mean, it's a fantasy series, that has a very particular play style. It doesn't really have that kind of JRPG-ness that kind of calls to people. So it doesn't really cross demographics. So I don't think Saga could ever really be more than niche. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's because it does something so different and so distinctive. But I think that really kneecaps its ability to really reach across the mainstream. And I think the developers will be proud of that. I think the developers are proud of the fact that they were not doing something for the mainstream. It kind of loses out because of that.
Yeah, unfortunately. So, critical darling, but never going to be a sales giant. That's just kind of how it goes.
Yeah.
I'll give you something. Every time I buy a new Sega Ages release on the Switch, they have a questionnaire. And they ask you, which game would you want to see in the Sega Ages collection? And they tell me just one. Every single time, Panzer Dragoon Saga is the answer. So, Sega, you haven't been listening. I've been sending quite a few of those.
Unfortunately, I put Dragon Force on that, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, that would be fantastic as well.
Yeah, that would be really good too. But we're gonna
Just
go
the
off,
Saturn era.
We're gonna go off the rails
this...
if we keep going on about which games we want to see re-released. Let's get back on track here. So, personal attachment is next. Our experience, our personal attachment to these games. I don't think we need to spend too much time on this. Yeah, like we're all pretty much pro Panzer Dragoon Saga, pretty much as we are anti Spyro, just because of our own personal experiences with both, right?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, I've known about Panzer Dragoon Saga for so long now. I mean, going back years and years and years, and it's just been this mythical game. That in and of itself, without having played the game, is a personal attachment of some sort.
Yeah. Just the story of it, even if you haven't played it, it's very interesting, and it is kind of mythical, like it's got something there. I guess that kind of, segues very nicely into Legacy, where we talk about whether the game was genre defining, did it leave a mark at all in the video game world? And I mean, Spyro to me is the clear cut winner here, depending on how much value we attribute to Panzer Dragoon Saga's kind of cult status, that mystique, the fact that the source code is lost, that it makes, quite frankly, it makes for a better story of a game than Spyro, right? Spyro was, not to be too reductive, but Nintendo had a Mario 64. We need a Mario 64. Here comes Spyro. Yeah. You know what I mean? And I hate to say it, but that's really kind of what it comes down to. Whereas Panzer Dragoon, it's a little bit more tortured. It's got, like I said, the source code being lost. How much value are we attributing to that? I don't know. What do you think, Kelly?
Kelly, go.
No, for me, it would be Panzer Dragoon Saga. Just that history of it. That cult status. It was the first game I remember as being, oh my god, it is so rare, you must find a copy. I spent years looking for it and finally found it and was just super happy when I finally did. Just that cult status, that for me, it is what started collectors for me. I don't know if it's for anyone else or just me, but just
me too.
That one game that's the holy grail, that for me, it just seems to be for a lot of people, that game.
Yeah.
I mean,
for,
it's
go ahead, Ozzy.
no, it's complicated for me because it's a game that you don't see its DNA necessarily in a ton of other games of the genre. Like we said, the battle system is kind of a cul-de-sac. There isn't any other battle system like it. But, in the spirit of 1998, it had a lot of the harbingers and a lot of the signs of what would later come, and what was to be the future of video games. Like we said, it had a lot of cutscenes. It was fully voice acted.
First
and it
game,
was all made up,
fully voiced.
And it was all in a made up language. And so the only other game in that year was Metal Gear Solid that was trying to do the same thing. And it was trying to tell a very cinematic story, trying to advance the medium in that manner. And I think in that sense, it really was ahead of its time. It's a game that was trying to break the medium apart and trying to say, Final Fantasy is great and all, but we're trying to see it from an entirely different perspective. We're trying to have a paradigm shift here. And a lot of it kind of stuck. I mean, I'm not saying that people were influenced by Panzer Dragoon Saga because they probably weren't. I mean, the only other game developer that I see being influenced by Panzer Dragoon and Saga in particular was probably Fumito Ueda, because Ico, I see a lot of shades of Panzer Dragoon in Ico.
Good call.
Particularly with the made-up language, etc. But it's just, it did a lot of the things that would become de facto in the industry, in later years. And eventually you had something like Metal Gear Solid 4, which was almost more cutscenes than gameplay itself. And I think that, it's not only the mystical and mythical aspect of Panzer Dragoon Saga. I think that it's a game that stands very well on its own in terms of its own contributions to the genre and to the medium. I think it did a lot that a lot of games at the time were not really doing. And I think it should be credited for that. Whereas you see something like Spyro, and again, it did things very well, and it was emulating Mario 64 in terms of its open design, but it was derivative. And it was really kind of a proof of concept in my view. If you put a lot of stock on the idea of, will people still play it? I mean, for that, you still have, something like critical reception and legacy and stuff like that. But I don't think that should overwhelm the positive, breakthroughs that Panzer Dragoon Saga really brought to the fold.
Should we not give more credit to Spyro for creating a character that evolved over time and is still beloved today, whereas Panzer Dragoon has zero of that?
I mean, like every other mascot platformer around the time.
All right, that's the answer. That's all I wanted to hear, really.
Is it
I gave it a shot,
so
dude.
beloved now? Or are people just sad that it became Skylanders and Spyro was kind of pushed to the side, and the legacy has been tarnished?
Don't be swayed by the power of nostalgia. That's what I'm trying to say. Nostalgia clouds your judgment, and a lot of this is being ridden by nostalgia. The first Spyro is not a great game. I hate to say it. The second one, the third one is very lovely, but the first one is very basic. It's very elementary, and it has one of the biggest flaws of any collectathon, and that is that whatever you're collecting has no purpose whatsoever. No purpose whatsoever. I mean, even some games like Banjo-Kazooie actually had a purpose to what you were collecting. You would actually get things out of it. With this, you collect gems, and they have no meaning whatsoever. So, nostalgia is a very big thing. And I think that if you're talking about legacy, the legacy of Panzer Dragoon Saga is almost gargantuan in nature compared to its peers, because it's kind of just this forgotten gem. It's this game that left an imprint without necessarily being successful. Whereas in Spyro, you have the complete opposite, where it was successful, but it really left no imprint.
Good enough.
It's like empty calories. That's what Spyro is.
Look, man, I gave it a shot. I had to throw something in there for Spyro. but ultimately, of course, I agree with you guys, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's no question in my mind.
Yeah.
So
my vote is Panzer Dragoon Saga, if you haven't.
Yeah, no. For legacy, I think we're on board with that. It's funny, Kelly, that you mentioned the collecting, and that's kind of like what that was kind of the impetus, the catalyst for you, if you will, because it's similar on my end, because I was out of gaming for a while until about 4 or 5 years ago. And then I revisited some of the old games that I had, and I was like, well, the reason I revisited them was because I was looking at selling off what I had. And the one game that I looked at that I had, because I bought Panzer Dragoon Saga when it was released, that was the one game I looked at, and I was like, I can't sell this. I can't.
Right.
Like, it's too special, and it's too valuable, right? But more special than valuable. Let's not kid ourselves. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to re-explore some of these older games. And now I am on a podcast. So, Panzer Dragoon Saga, man. When I first got that game, sorry to, digress a little bit here, but I remember, and I was like, I think I was 18. I was working part-time. I walked into EB Games on a Wednesday and shocked that I saw Panzer Dragoon Saga on the shelf, because I knew that there was a limited print run, and I just never expected to see it in town. I wasn't even really looking for it. But there it was on the shelf, and I was like, oh my God. And I knew I had no money, because I wasn't going to get paid till Friday, and I was 18, so of course I had no money. So I walked up to the counter and asked the guy, can you please hold this for me? I'm getting paid on Friday. I really want this game. And he's like, no, get out of here. we're not doing this, right? And I was like, oh man, I was so dejected. And I walked out of the store, and I took about 5 steps outside the store, and I remembered that I had $10 in my wallet. And the light bulb went on in my head, and I walked back in and I said, hey, can I put a $10 deposit and pick it up in 2 days? And then they relented, and I picked it up 2 days later.
Nice.
Very close to not getting it. Anyhow, lasting appeal. Which of these games would you rather play today? Again, we don't need to spend too much time on this one, yeah?
I was playing it last night, so, that pretty much should tell you it all right there.
Listen, in the interest of professionalism, I played Spyro the Dragon for 1.5 hours. And what I could say is, I did not hate my time with it. And that's about it.
You can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Got it.
Yep. And obviously, I'd much rather play Panzer Dragoon Saga. There's no question. Spyro, I mean, look, this is all personal preference. I'm pretty sure we could get 3 different people on the show and have completely different answers. But for better or worse, it's 3 of us, and I think Panzer Dragoon Saga is moving ahead. Am I right?
Yes.
I mean, if it doesn't, then there's no God. I mean, Arnie's not here, so...
But wait. Let me think about it for a minute here. Okay. Never mind.
All right.
I was really hoping that Panzer Dragoon Saga was not going to get Arnie'd. I'm going to make that into a verb.
The heaping of praise onto something undeserved. Getting Arnie'd. Poor guy. He's going to hear this. He's not going to be happy with us.
Yeah, but, Spyro, you were a waste of a perfectly good spot.
Stop it. No, it deserves to be on the 16. There's a lot it did right there. I don't think we were too hard on it.
No, I think it was fine. It was fine. It was just that. Fine.
All right. So we're going to end it on that note. Hey, Kelly, thanks again for joining us. This was a lot of fun as usual.
Oh, yes, anytime.
It was long in the making.
Yeah, no kidding.
We did our first episode in July.
We were in development hell, just like Panzer Dragoon Saga.
Yeah.
That's actually a very accurate way of putting it.
Now, the only thing that could go wrong is that we lose all of our audience.
Oh, now you said it.
I have to talk about Spyro for another hour.
Anyhow, yeah. So again, thanks, Kelly, for joining us. Thanks, everyone, for listening. As usual, visit us on our website, regionfreegamers.com, or talk to us on Instagram. That's mainly where we do most of our communication. On Instagram, we are at Region Free Gamers Podcast. On Twitter, because of the character limit, we are at Region Free Gamer, and Arnie's manning our Twitter as well, so you can mostly reach out to him there. You can find Kelly on Instagram at Sierra Knight.
Sierra Knight _ gaming. And I'm also on Twitter at Sierra Knight 24. So, yep.
Okay, thank you. I would have messed that up. So thanks for stepping in. Gotta say, Kelly's Instagram page, probably like one of my, I don't know, top 10 favorites, because she's got this great collection that is just so much fun to drool over on a semi-daily basis. Like the shelves with the Vita games, like it's just so much fun to look at. And then you have really thoughtful and well-informed and experienced captions there too. I love following it, and I highly recommend others do as well.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, I will say, by the time this comes out, I swear, Paul, I will have an article on our website, regionfreegamers.com, speaking something positive about Spyro the Dragon.
I can't wait.
So,
right on. I'm looking forward to reading that. I, on the other hand, will play Panzer Dragoon Saga and probably not write anything about it at all. But I'm looking forward to the work that you guys are putting in, because you guys are better writers than I am. So anyhow, again, thanks everyone for listening. Take care.